Welcome to this latest session in our education series on Marx and learning from Marx and Engels. Tonight we're discussing Marx's why he took the struggle for democracy so seriously. And this is perhaps a little bit controversial on the left, where often if you look at Marxists, mainstream Marxists will put a lot of emphasis on the struggle for higher wages, working conditions, the economic struggle, important as it is. But Karl Marx certainly made a huge effort to engage in the struggle for democracy, as he called it. And Kevin will no doubt go into that a lot. Some people think that might have been a quirk of Marx, is that he took quite so much effort and looked so much into the fight for a republic against monarchy, electoral form, these kind of things. But I think they actually go to the heart of what Marx's method for achieving socialism was. The working class has to take these questions seriously if it wants to become the ruling class, and we have to take these issues of democratic control over society very important in the here and now, and take them on. And I think there's an issue there today still with the left, that not many are doing that. But Kevin will no doubt tell us much more and much more eloquently about this issue. So thanks very much, Kevin. Welcome. I'm highlighting you now.
Okay, thanks very much, Tina. Well, since you've told everybody what I'm going to say, I think we can just move straight to the questions.
Sorry.
Yeah. Tonight's talk brings in some things of that was a joke, by the way, Tina.
Good.
Tonight's talk does bring in some things that I in one of my earlier talks that I didn't have time to bring in. So it's going to focus on Marx's views on democracy and its significance, but also talk a little bit about his political development, and in particular how he moved from being a revolutionary Democrat, an extreme revolutionary Democrat, to being a communist, and how he saw democracy and the idea of democracy within that. There are a couple of things I'd like, and questions maybe for comrades to consider. The first one is really of our understanding of democracy, and indeed the fact that we often take the word, or the word can be taken for granted. Like many words, it's a word that's changed over time. And indeed, at the time that Marx was writing, the word democracy was often used in this form. It was often referred to as the democracy, meaning a current, although the term at the time might well have been party, but the term party didn't really mean what we think of a party today, but as a sort of a current, a democratic current, or indeed as meaning the mass of the population, the people, and the idea of the democracy against the classes, against the elites, against the ruling class. So even in raising the idea of democracy, Marx was raising an idea that was far from uncontroversial. Indeed, when we bear in mind that Marx starts to develop these ideas of democracy in the early 1840s, he's really only writing something like 30 to 40 years after the French Revolution, when the idea of democracy is linked very clearly with ideas of unrest, but ideas of fundamental social and political change. So even the use of the term is not uncontroversial itself. The other thing that I wanted comrades to consider as well, a number of other words and ideas. In the 1950s, the Marxist critic, a literary critic, but also a political and historical critic, Raymond Williams, developed the idea of what he called key words. And he actually wrote about the history of a number of quite important words that we have in English. So if you get the book, and it is still available, it's a very interesting book. Rather like a dictionary, he tells you the meaning of the word, but he looks at its etymology, and indeed he looks at its history. And the whole series of words that he has in there and in particular the idea of democracy or class. All of these ideas change, I think, over time. So what we're looking at now is the context of democracy in Marx's time in the middle to the latter part of the 19th century. So let's just remind ourselves of that world. Let's remember that outside of America, and even there the franchise was in practice limited, that conceptions of democracy were extremely limited. So that most people don't have any direct formal political influence. Most of the world are governed by monarchies, they're governed by empires, they're governed by elites, often landowning elites. And in most countries in Europe, the bourgeoisie is in fact in a very much a subordinate position. On top of that, it's also a world in which the working class in the 1840s is growing. It's becoming stronger. Industrialization is bringing change. But again, particularly in the underdeveloped areas of Europe, the working class is small. We have rural populations, some landowners, some wage laborers, and indeed, the further east we go, we're likely to encounter serfdom and various forms of feudal tenure. In other words, we're talking about a world which in many ways is undergoing fantastic, radical, dramatic change, but it is also a very different world from our own. So the importance of democracy and the ideas of democracy is really very central. Many of the democratic rights that we, I say take for granted, but I don't think many people on the left do, but perhaps they don't devote that sufficient attention to them. But many of the democratic rights that we do tend to take for granted don't exist. And that indeed, even to call for them, to call for example, for the end of censorship, or to call for the end of prohibitions on the publication of newspapers, or imprisonment for having seditious ideas. Many of these are important restrictions on freedoms, much less the fact that there are no real parliamentary assemblies, no real political movements, at least until the 1840s and the revolutions of 1848, where some gains are made. And indeed, if you just think about this for a moment, it occurred to me as I was preparing this that when all four of my grandparents were born, they didn't have the right to vote, and indeed could not expect to have the right to vote. And I would say that for most of us here, not only our grandmothers, but actually I'm just thinking probably there are not that many people quite as old as me, but my grandparents are born variously in the 1880s and the 1890s. And they, of course, didn't have the right to vote. So political democracy of the sort that is often assumed to be of long lineage in Britain is in fact relatively new. And I think, again, another point that's worth making in terms of a narrative of democracy as a natural evolving process in which Britain has been moving through its history towards our current democratic state. Indeed, one of the interesting questions in the historiography, the wider academic history about the 19th century and about the growth of forms of political democracy, is the role of the working class movement in that. And of course, if we're going to talk about the importance of the working class movement in this way, then we need to look more importantly at Marx and Engels in their role in developing working class movements and indeed formulating the idea of a socialist approach to democracy and the centrality of democracy in that way. So having sort of introduced that, I'll now try and look at the ideas of Marx and Engels as well on the importance of democracy and where those ideas came from. Well, I've talked about the French Revolution, and obviously the left of the French Revolution argued for the sovereignty of the people. Indeed, the idea of the state being in some senses the embodiment of the people, and the relationship between a state and its population was a central issue in political theory. And numerous writers, whether they be from the radical democratic left or indeed from more conservative sections of society, were discussing those issues, particularly as in the early 19th century, we start to see the emergence of a proletariat in Britain, industrialization, tremendous developments in that way, and new social forces emerge. And in particular, we see the emergence of not only the proletariat, of course, but a bourgeoisie. And in the 1830s, in 1832, the electoral system is changed, the so-called Great Reform Act, and there's a widespread agitation that brings this act into existence, and it shifts some of the voting and a degree of political influence towards the bourgeoisie, but it still leaves the mass of the population, even quite wide sections of the bourgeoisie, disenfranchised and excluded. And of course, in this sort of sense of betrayal, that this agitation, which had pressurized for democracy, had resulted really only in a very limited extension of the vote, then I think contributed very significantly to the emergence of Chartism, which as a form begins in the late 1830s. Again, these are some areas which we've had previous talks on, so comrades can go back and look at some of the earlier sessions last year that dealt with these themes. Now, Marx and Engels were very taken with what they saw occurring in front of their eyes in terms of the growth of a working class democratic movement. And the Chartist movement was in fact something of a model for them. Indeed, writing in the 1890s, Engels said that when it came to organization of the workers, his phrase was, the English had shown us how to do it. And so as Marx and Engels are starting to develop their ideas, in front of them in the 1840s is the example of the Chartist movement. And how they began to understand Chartism, as indeed many of the left wing of the Chartist movement did themselves, was that the Chartist demands for political democracy were not abstract demands. They were very clearly linked to the idea that gaining political rights would be a useful platform, a useful means of developing political demands in this way. So Marx and Engels particularly saw this relationship between the specific demands of the Chartists and this wider question of political influence, this wider question of using political democracy as an instrument for wider social and working class purposes. But Marx and Engels had begun as essentially radical Democrats, and what they began to see was a contradiction between the ideas of radical democracy, extreme democracy, the vote for everybody, democratic accountability of parliamentary representatives, a republic, all of these things they've been pushing for. But they began to also see that those ideas of democracy, pure and simple, would not truly lead to the sort of radical ideas of the French Revolution, the ideas of the sovereignty of the people, because of course of social class and social inequalities. So that the purely democratic aims could not be achieved without social change. In other words, a class question, a question of the change in society. That democracy was a first stage. Democracy was important, but without those other elements, there could be no genuine democracy, because social and economic power, the power of the ruling class, would have been removed. So they very quickly moved from the position of simply arguing for democracy to linking that to ideas of socialist transformation. Now, that may not seem very profound, but in the context of the time, and again, I draw comrades' attention to one of the earlier talks by Mark Mulholland on socialist ideas. At the time, people who called themselves communists were often quite opposed to what we think of as political action. Many of these communists or socialists were quite utopian. They might believe that you could start some sort of utopian community and that the example of this community would spread. Or they believe that you could, for example, appeal to the rich, you could appeal to the elite, you could appeal even to Queen Victoria, and you might send her a book about how you might remodel society. She'd read it and tell the government, gosh, this communism seems a wonderful thing, let's do it. So the actual transformation of society was usually seen as either something in a way to emerge almost accidentally, or by appealing to the status quo in some way. There was also some arguments, particularly amongst some of the those perhaps more influenced by elements of the French Revolution, of a type of conspiratorialism, which was that that an armed uprising could be organized, and that this, presumably a relatively small group of people, could in a sense overthrow the existing order and then on behalf of the population liberate them. What was not really developed, and this is where Chartism was so significant for Marx, was of course the idea of the emancipation of the working class, not being carried out by a minority, not being carried out by philanthropists, not being carried out by the state, but being carried out by the working class themselves. And this, I think, is the central idea of democracy in Marx's writing. And he moves to this idea fairly quickly. This is quite a core idea. It's there in the Communist Manifesto in section 2. It obviously shows the development of ideas that have been prevalent amongst radical Democrats from the time of the French Revolution, but of course from those earlier revolutions that we looked at. But what's being done now is to translate that into social change. So if you look at section 2 of the Communist Manifesto, and it is up on the materials that I've put up on the reading list there. Marx says, and Marx was primarily the author of the Communist Manifesto. He says in the section, proletarians and communists, the immediate aim of the communist is the same as that of other proletarian parties. Formation of the proletariat into a class, and that's an important point, a sense of their own class identity, but also a consciousness of a particular historical role. Not just that I'm working class, but I'm working class and that means something, that I have a mission, I have a drive, I can achieve something. So the formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. Now, that idea of the conquest of political power is the idea that the revolution is not simply going to be spontaneous. It's not simply going to be haphazard. It's a conscious project. It involves, a transformation of the state and the transformation of society. It's particularly arguing against some of the utopian ideas of socialism at that point, that this is a political movement, and that as such, it requires, a conscious political direction in that way. So Marx draws on these existing democratic ideas and he extends them, and indeed draws in ideas of how politics, political democracy will be the terrain on which the battle for power is conducted. The other important point here about the abstraction of democracy is that Marx, both in the Communist Manifesto and elsewhere, identifies the working class as the universal class, as the class that in a sense can lead society. They're the only class with the capacity and indeed the interest to realize the idea of the sovereignty of the people. And again, this is very much runs through the Communist Manifesto. So at the stage that Marx is writing the Communist Manifesto, he still sees communists as the most advanced or extreme wing of the Democratic Party who will fight for political democracy. Again, the term party doesn't mean, it probably would be better expressed in modern terms as a current or a set of ideas rather than a party which is with memberships and with structures and so on. So the use of the word party here is, I think, referring to this sort of current in this way. Now, democracy then builds on this idea of the democracy, builds also on the idea of the popular classes. It builds on the idea of both the working class and, I think, increasingly, as we will see in 1848, with other sections of society, for example, the rural peasantry, and also sections of the petty bourgeois populations of the cities. Again, I go back to the world in which Marx is working, that there are all sorts of intermediate classes, artisans who may, for example, own a small business, but are moving towards being proletarianized. There will also be various small farmers and others in whom capitalism is starting to exert its pressures, who may well have different class structure, indeed a different class view of the world, but could still be allies for the proletariat that Marx identifies as the central class in this way. The other important point, I think, as well about this idea of democracy is, although it's very clearly linked to demands in particular countries, and again, what's interesting in terms of the French revolutionary tradition is that the idea of the nation and the people and the state, in a sense, are fused in many of these democratic ideas. It's also quite important to see this, this pattern in terms of internationalism. Remember that in the 1840s, but it will go on into the 1860s and 70s and 80s, nationalist movements are demanding national democracies. So there's a movement for Irish independence. And of course, the other big movement in Europe is the Polish movement. So Marx is talking there not in terms of nationalism as we might understand it, or as it's understood in the popular sense. He's arguing for self-determination, for national independence as being part of the national democratic revolution. And this again, I think, is a very central point, that when Marx is supporting nationalist movements, he does so on democratic grounds. Now, the 1848 revolution is in many ways the turning point for these ideas. And Marx does play an important role in that revolution. In 1848, he is the editor of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, which is based in Cologne. And this paper has as its subtitle, The Organ of the Democracy. And it's regarded as the most left democratic paper in Germany. What's interesting is that Marx identifies himself with the democratic revolution. And indeed, when we look at some of the politics of Cologne in this period, we see tensions between his approach and some of the existing working class organizations who want to put forward what he argues are sectional demands. There's a big debate in the historiography about this, whether these movements are essentially those movements were of artisans, and indeed these people were not trying to assert a proletarian status, but a particular sort of small producer status. We can perhaps return to that point later on. But what he does is, what he does in this period, both in the Communist Manifesto, but also in another leaflet, which again I've put up on the reading list, called The Demands of the Communist Party in Germany. He puts forward a series of demands there, and in particular, he puts forward democratic demands, particularly the demand for a democratic republic, but he does so in terms of the relationship between the bourgeois revolution and what he thinks will become the working class revolution. So he says, the German proletariat says, can and must accept the bourgeois revolution as a precondition for the workers' revolution. However, they cannot for a moment accept it as their goal. And indeed, a little later in that pamphlet, Engels says, democracy will be quite useless to the proletariat if it were not immediately used when it comes to power as a means of carrying through the socialist transformation of society. So in other words, that the support for the democratic revolution, the support for the republic in Germany is part of this democratic revolutionary process in that way. Now, what Marx expected or hoped would be that the German revolution would win the battle for democracy, and that this would then become the first stage, or the first part of what he called the Revolution Impermanence. And indeed, that phrase is going to come up again. But of course, as we know, and again, if you look at some of the readings, Marx writes about what happens in that revolution, that bourgeoisie failed dismally. It was spineless. It refused, indeed, to carry the revolution forward. And when faced with confrontation with the reactionary states, such as Prussia, it caved in. And Marx's explanation for this is quite simple. Admittedly, it's unfolding during the revolution, but he realizes that as this new bourgeoisie is coming into existence, its gravedigger, the proletariat, is also coming into existence. So it has this choice. Does it ally with the proletariat and risk that revolution impermanence that Marx talks about, or does it side with the feudal reaction? And indeed, we know that both in Germany, but also in the Habsburg Empire, and indeed in other revolutions, the bourgeoisie goes over to the reaction in this way. So the bourgeoisie does not carry out the bourgeois revolution. And indeed, the only genuinely revolutionary elements are usually the urban workers and some sections of the urban petty bourgeoisie, the students and various radicals in that way. Now, what the 1848 revolution does, and its failure, it forces Marx and Engels to really draw up a balance sheet of what occurred, and to look about where the revolution went wrong, but also about the relationship of the working class and the idea of the democratic revolution. Marx and Engels became quite self-critical in the immediate 2 or 3 years after the revolution. They thought, for example, that they'd made some tactical mistakes, that, for example, in not encouraging independent working class organization, that they may not have sort of strengthened the proletariat as a revolutionary group. But I think it's important to note that they were also aware of the relative weakness of the proletariat in many of those countries. In Germany, for example, the proletariat was a relatively small group. Industrialization, as we might understand it, certainly on the British model, was confined only to certain areas. And so that self-criticism, in a sense, reflects the circumstances that they faced at the time. But one thing that does come very clear is that they frame their demands politically and democratically, but they don't have particular illusions in this, and they don't particularly have ideas that pushing for democracy is both the end of the struggle, but also that this idea of pushing for democracy is sufficient. In an address by the various ways of translating it, I prefer central committee, but maybe the central directing authority of the Communist League, they issue a statement drawing up a balance sheet of these issues, and it says, the German proletariat themselves must do the utmost for their final victory by making clear to themselves what their class interests are, by taking up their position as an independent party as soon as possible, by not allowing themselves to be misled for a single moment or for a single movement by the hypocritical phrases of the democratic petty bourgeois, into refraining from the independent organization of the party of the proletariat. Their battle cry must be the Revolution Impermanence. So the idea of democracy is now firmly inscribed on the proletariat's banner, but the betrayals of the petty bourgeoisie and of course the bourgeoisie mean that that independence is now quite central in that way. So the other point, it's not contained in the extract that I've read, but the other point as well, of course, is that not only are they now arguing for distinct working class organization, but also that that organization should be armed and indeed be prepared to defend its gains, expecting from the experience of the German events and indeed elsewhere in Europe that the bourgeoisie will behave in that particular way. Now, in the years that follow, in the 1850s and the 1860s, political movements amongst the working class start to reform. They emerge often around trade unions, but increasingly they start to take on a political form. And it's here, I think, that that Marx becomes really very influential. We often, certainly in academic circles, often tend to see Marx primarily as a theorist. There are plenty of jokes about Marx, you know, spending his time in the British Museum and the British Library and so on and so forth, and that he, you know, didn't really engage with the real world. That was all, you know, primarily theoretical. But Marx became a political activist. He was in close contact with a wide range of working class opinion. And the First International, which again we talked about in previous sessions, is really a product of that. And from that First International, there are then a whole series of developments that spread into other European countries, most notably in Germany, also in France as well. Now, what is interesting here is that in both the foundation documents of the First International and in the succeeding documents is this linking of the idea of democracy and indeed of political development by the working class in sort of distinction to a very limited idea of their political role. Having fought, in a sense, within the communist movement in the 1840s to put across the idea of political action, Marx is now engaged in a much wider area against other trends. And those other trends are often, for example, reformist. They believe in gradual change or obtaining concessions by bargaining, for example, amongst the trade unions, or as in the case in Germany, with the so-called Lassallean current in German social democracy, of forming alliances with the state, with the feudal aristocracy, with Bismarck against the bourgeoisie, indeed of, in a sense, bending the stick the other way, as it were, and of seeing the the feudal aristocracy as allies against the bourgeoisie, and you're seeing the state as an instrument, a ready-made instrument that could bring benefits, could bring immediate reforms and changes for the working class. So Marx is now in a way having to refight a different type of battle. And what's interesting when we look at the inaugural address and the rules of the First International is that central theme about democracy is still there. And again, you know, I don't see anything wrong in this as being, you know, our slogans, but he says the two essentials are: to conquer political power has become the great duty of the working class, and the emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working class themselves. And again, this idea of democracy as being, in a sense, not only the means to mobilize, but also the means to educate, to prepare, to develop the class consciousness, to develop the potential of the proletariat to actually do that, to become the ruling class. One of the things that we might see this is that some of the events that lead up to the First International are not simply economic struggles. They're not just simply the trade union solidarity between French and British workers. There are also solidarity movements. And indeed, in the 1860s, the idea that the working class could intervene politically in affairs of state, that the high politics of bourgeois society or the foreign policy, that the working class movement should have its own foreign policy. So British workers, for example, adopt a position and indeed take action to a certain extent in support of the Union side in the American Civil War. They send a letter to, send an address to President Lincoln, and they argue that the workers must have their own foreign policy, that they have their own interests, they have their own view on the world. So this means that the ideas of political involvement, of political development, fit in with this picture. The other aspect, of course, is the various movements and agitations that are being carried out in the 1860s. The Reform League, which is again, the First International and the radical left does have a very important role in this, in agitating for the extension of the franchise. And it's partially successful in getting an extension of the franchise, but again, it's not the full democracy. It's manhood suffrage for heads of households. So it extends essentially the vote to better off workers, urban workers. Nevertheless, the movement that it builds up and the pressure it exerts is, Marx regards, a very important sort of training school, as it were, a good opportunity for workers to learn the power of their struggle, but also to link their more immediate struggles and their demands to this wider, political context. The First International takes ideas of democracy very seriously, and this is because not only is Marx having to counter ideas of reformism, but he's also having to counter ideas of the Bakuninists, the anarchists, who reject many of the political conclusions, the idea of politics in that sense. But probably the major problem, certainly that Marx encounters in the 60s, and indeed will be a problem, I think, for Marxists more generally, is what we might call trade union consciousness, and indeed the idea that democracy has its limits, or indeed that politics has its limits. Speaking at one of the last conferences of the International, the last conference in The Hague, but it's in the middle 1860s. Marx, who's been engaged in a certain to battle with the British trade unionists affiliated to the International, says, too exclusively bent upon the local and immediate struggles with capital, the trade unions have not yet fully understand their power of acting against the system of wage slavery itself. They therefore kept too much aloof from general social and political movements. They must now learn to act deliberately as organizing centers of the working class in the broad interests of its complete emancipation. They must now convince the world at large, and in the French text, that's changed to the broad mass of workers, but the world at large, that their efforts, far from being narrow and selfish, aim at the emancipation of the downtrodden millions. Now, what I think is significant about this is that this idea of democracy is not, as I've really pushed, is not really just about rights to vote, or even, I think, of obtaining, immediate demands. It's actually the idea of developing a particular type of consciousness. Now, at this stage, Marx is talking primarily about trade unions, but very quickly there will emerge in continental Europe a series of parties that will have the idea of conscious socialist transformation, of developing campaigns of mobilization of workers. And those movements in Germany and in France will start to develop they will start to develop political programs which have both the ideas of the complete emancipation of the working class, but also the idea of the position of democracy within that, the role of democracy within that. I want to just sort of finish on this point. I've just realised I've spoken for quite a bit longer than I intended on that particular point, but this idea of campaigning for political democracy, this idea of it being a training school as a means of developing the workers' consciousness, I think is not just a sort of set of stages. I think that what underlies it is a particular idea of political consciousness and how that consciousness can be raised. It's an important question, and indeed I think it comes up when socialists and others on the left are talking about how they can win the mass of the population for socialism and the ways that this should be done. And what's very clear here is that it's seen not as a series of immediate struggles. It's actually seen, I think, as part of a much wider political struggle that raises the question of ownership and control over property and the social structure in general. So I think it's clearly linked into that. The other point as well that Marx and Engels develop, particularly when they're discussing Germany and countries where this movement is starting to grow, is its relationship to armed revolution and indeed the revolutionary sort of pattern that was expected from the experience of 1848 and the French Revolution. And there, the argument isn't that the revolution will be peaceful, or indeed that it is simply about parliamentary majorities, but actually that this parliamentary campaigning is a means to develop a mass movement, which then in turn can begin the struggle for power. And I think what Marx and Engels both expected would be that the working class movement would grow to be such a power in society that any armed action would initially come from the owners of property. They use the analogy of the American Civil War and the idea of the slave owners' revolt. So it isn't the idea that the state will be taken up ready-made. And indeed, the Paris Commune, I think, develops that idea about the nature of that state. And indeed, Marx, in his criticisms of the German Social Democrats in the 1870s and the critique of the Gotha program, does does something of the same. He's arguing that the state isn't just simply a ready-made instrument. But unlike the Bakuninists and the anarchists, and indeed the trade unionists, he doesn't say that it can be ignored or it can be just regarded as a sort of natural fixture. It has to be engaged with, and indeed it's an important sort of training school. It's an important way of raising the consciousness of the working class. Anyway, my apologies, I overran slightly, but I will leave it there.
Thank you, comrade. Yes, that was much longer than usual, but as always, as enjoyable as always your sessions. Lots of interesting questions raised there. There's been 2 in the Q&A, which I'm going to quickly read out. Paul Fletcher is asking, could you say a little bit more about how Marx defined the difference between democracy in terms of the legislative state, the representative state, and democracy in civil society, direct democracy? What was his view of the struggles for universal voting? Oliver Perkins is asking, and you touched on this towards the end, I think, and when you're touching on workers' militia, etc. Could you outline why, in your view, many modern Marxists, mainly Trotskyists and Bernsteinists, interpret the Marxist demand for democracy, the republic, workers' militia, etc., as a maximum demand for the distant future, rather than as an immediate necessity, as Marx did? And it mentions Rosa Luxemburg's phrase, distant guiding star. I think there's also, didn't the Labour Party at some stage have the demand for a workers' militia in its program? And that'd be a nice thing to look back at. Okay, there's two people who've put their hand up, Alan and Anthony. I'm taking Alan first. Comrades, if you want to raise a question or make a contribution, please click the raise hand button. Very loud. Alan, is that possibly your computer? Very loud fan. Huge loud. Do you think I could take Anthony first and see if you can switch that off? Really, really loud. Thank you. Anthony, do you want to come in? I hope you don't have a loud fan on. But you're muted. You're still muted, comrade.
I'll twist that, don't I? If I'm a bit fast, can you tell me the autistic condition? I've got improved in the last few months. But I think the thing you've got to talk about why the relevance of this period is because there's on the worst crisis of capitalism, there's instability and turmoil everywhere. When Marx was writing, he was saying it's still the dawn and the ascendancy of capitalism. But what he learned was the intense class struggle. And as Kevin said, when framed with the working class and made compromise with the feudal elements, what Bismarck did was it unified the capitalists and the aristocrats by industrializing it, but it didn't solve the land question without afraid his own power. But he had to go on with industrialization in unity. So it was resolved that way. But what Trotsky said about Marx was, and this is to do with colonialism, the reason Marx didn't seek to fight against post-colonialism and didn't talk about the nationality before capitalism was going to go straight away. Didn't think it boomed for 30 or 40 years, which delayed the world revolution. But I think what this question of democracy is relevant, I think there's going to be a rise of revolutionary ideas in the masses and mass struggles. And what's interesting on Twitter is the early ideas of Lenin and Trotsky are spreading. One example, they're saying that the general ideas of the epoch of necessity to get rid of capitalism are becoming equally more important. And then the practical experience of the masses will bring that with the highest form of theory. That's one of the quotes on Trotsky. And that's why I think the Corbyn campaign, the peace and justice movement, is so important in organising against the poor poverty. But even on the back of workers that are insular, they said to me, if we actually do get a better world, that'd be better. So if we could show improvements in other countries, that can actually improve things. But we also, whenever there's a threat to capitalism, they always plan the Stalinist crimes to undermine socialism. That's why the Cold War is whipping up with China and Russia today. There's all kinds of currents around the world. We don't know all the maneuvering that goes on with the different forces. the imperialists, and they always play on the weakness, which happened with problems in the early 20s, even in the Civil War. I remember Trotsky saying at the Third World Congress of the Third International, they're playing the social discontent then. It's one thing to overthrow Stalinism and the capitalist inroads, but they're trying to restore capitalism, and that man, Navalny, is a very dangerous man. Because if those fascists are run out in Ukraine, the Russians don't work as saying intervene or the threat them to intervene, there could be a lot more Jewish people dying, and all the workers' conditions could have gone down. But that man's linked to a very extreme right-wing force. My father, a few years before he started, was studying it when he was reading hundreds of articles on Russia. He became a specialist on it, and he's run the Trotsky Movement for 60 years. But the working class won't be fooled. But the Swain brothers said something interesting. They died on Jeffrey Swain of Eastern Europe a few years ago. They're specialists from 45 to 2009. And some of the reason the capitalists made inroads, some of the young people didn't experience capitalism before World War II, were naive. And some of the youth in the protest might be that kind of naivety. But we also have to have a social program to win them. When I was at university in Wolverhampton 2009, one of the things Colin did was, it's not unlike the West where you have all your benefits. Every time you have a child, you have hundreds of rubles. And that has influence when I told that person that at university, that's a long time ago. And I was reading today, they've increased it in the last few months. Just an example. Well, we've got to fight for us. Sheena said that one of the first meetings. We won't fight for democracy. They're just for the maximum to ask for the workers to do that. But that's the society we want to build up. Trotsky wasn't listening to on revolution. I'll finish it.
Can you wind up now, comrade, please? Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, you have you?
Okay. I'll finish my point anyway. Literature, it's only a couple of sentences. Literature and revolution, they can determine health, education, all the art. And that's the kind of democracy we want to build in. That's very important. And that's why we have to say we've been fighting Stalin since 1923. It's hypocrisy. They're talking about a nuclear attack on Russia and China in the last day in all the papers. So we're global anti-nuclear one. I didn't mention that. We don't go the system those going to be alive. I'll leave it there.
Gotcha. Okay, Alan, we'll try you again. Thank you, Anthony. Oh, Alan, that's really loud.
Yeah. What's loud?
Let's try it. It's like a fan of a computer or something. Let's try it.
Can you hear me?
I think it's really close to your microphone, the fan. But let's try it. Let's see. I think it's.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I think that's okay.
Okay, I just wanted to pick up on you getting into it, actually.
Alan, there's something with your microphone. Sorry, there's something stuck to your microphone. It's got really bad thing.
Then I'll write as a question. That's a different backup from what I'm using. So.
Sorry, I can't hear what you're saying. Sorry.
I'll write it as a question.
Okay, write it as a question, or maybe you could try and join with your phone or something, or maybe Anne's computer or something. Okay, I'll bring somebody else in the meantime. Yeah, sorry, comrade. Okay, Marion, please. You're muted, comrade.
Yeah, I think the question of democracy is key. And it's key in so many ways. I mean, a lot of my experience in being involved in the left is the total lack of proper democracy. And I don't think you can develop people's ideas and stuff unless you have a healthy democratic debate. And I think that is key. And that's one of the things I think so clearly. I mean, I've been involved in a number of left organisations and most of them have lacked what I call democracy. And I don't think you can challenge and take on society unless there's democracy, because people can't develop. And I think, you know, someone who was a kind of late developer, didn't learn to write till I was 16, it's so important that there is proper space. But I also think it's key in everything, really. I mean, Tony Benn writes quite a lot about democracy as well. And I think unless we get that right, and it's about empowering people collectively and individually to actually take over society and fundamentally change things, because what we've lived the last 12 months actually shows what happens when you live in a rotten system where the wealth of the rich is deemed to be more important than the lives of people. So I think, you know, it's key that we recognise the need for that, because if we're going to actually fundamentally change society and bring about the forces to do that, then you need to be able to have proper debate and discussion in order to also motivate people as well. So for me, democracy is key, and unless we get that right, I mean, those of us that are in the Labour Party and those, unfortunately, that have been expelled in a totally undemocratic way is another illustration of it. But even my experiences in the trade union movement, you know, the total lack of democracy there as well is indicative that it is key that we need to fight for it tooth and nail. And you know, unless we do, we're not going to achieve what we need to achieve. But I'll leave it there. But fighting for democracy is key.
Thanks, Conrad. I agree. Kevin, do you want to answer a few things, or shall I take a few more contributions?
Yeah, I'll make a response, or to some of them anyway. Come back to others in a moment. Someone asked in the chat about sort of legislative democracy and direct democracy, and indeed Marx's ideas on the universal suffrage. Well, Marx did obviously support the idea of universal suffrage, and indeed was involved in movements that campaigned for it. And of course, in the 19th century, the idea that everybody should have the right to vote, and that even people who were possibly illiterate or who were of a lower social status could participate in politics, that was the revolutionary idea. When in 1867, for example, there were discussions in terms of extending the franchise, and there were all sorts of ideas put forward, so-called fancy franchises, that would give people with certain educational qualifications more votes, or would say that if you had property of a certain value, your voice was worth more than somebody else's. So the idea of everybody having a vote, in a sense, is a revolutionary idea, because it talks about the equality of all humans. But of course, that's only part of the story. And this is where Marx had moved from being simply a radical Democrat to a communist, because he obviously said that the true sovereignty of the people would not be realized until property was collectively owned, and that social power and economic power would prevent that being achieved. So the demand for the right to vote, the universal right to vote, was a very revolutionary idea, because it began with the premise that everybody had some sort of political, a political role to play in society. Marx did also take lessons from the Paris Commune, although I think those were still in the process of formation, particularly about the idea of combining both the legislative and the executive functions. So most constitutional demands that Marx has put forward in countries like Germany in particular, well, they were often framed around a democratic republic. They were framed around the universal right to vote. They were framed around the idea that the executive should be accountable. And so, if, for example, in the United States, there would be opposition to an executive president or to a sort of Bonapartist leader or prime minister, and the idea of the assembly representing the population. The idea as well probably would have been developing from the communes, would have been for a degree of decentralized power, but of course with full accountability, and areas which needed to be centralized and areas which needed to be decentralized. That I think would have been part of the democratic structure that was being envisaged. Anthony's points about Stalinism and revolutionary consciousness, I think, are actually quite significant. And I think they really link into Ollie Perkins' question on the issue of transitional demands and you know, this idea of how revolutionary consciousness develops. And what I think is interesting in both what Anthony says and the implication of Ollie's question is how we can take people from where they are at the moment within capitalist society, largely thinking within the frameworks of capitalist society, understanding the common sense of the world, is how to, in a sense, draw them forward. Now, the arguments that that socialists and Marxists in the 19th and the early 20th centuries advanced was through the idea of the minimum, the maximum program, and in particular the idea of posing, you know, the contest for political power. And I'm not going to answer this question fully because I think it's worthy of discussion, and obviously going to throw some points out. But it's very clear that the idea of democracy and of the self-emancipation of the working class and the self-organization of the working class is going to be important in that. And we've got a tremendous legacy, I think. Legacy is the wrong word, I think, for it, but we've got a sort of incubus of Stalinism and completely non-democratic politics, and in particular, ideas about how parties function and about the way that the party, in a sense, is the focus, and that the party, rather than the class, is going to be the sort of agency of revolution. Now, Marx, and more importantly, Engels and later on Lenin didn't sort of downplay that idea of the party. But the point is, it's its relationship with the working class. And I think Stalinism has very strengthened ideas of managerialism and instrumentalism in the working class movement. And indeed has tended, not just in the way that capitalists and Tories and others, you know, slate us with not being democratic, but I think in the way that Marion describes it, that this sort of lack of democracy and the cultures of democracy are often quite missing from our movement. It isn't just union bureaucracy, but I think it's the way that we see other comrades, or we see the way that people move into left politics. And I think we've got to see what we're doing as developing a culture and as a preparation for the transformation in society. In other words, that I know, you know, these can become sort of cliches, but you know, the idea that trade unions are schools for socialism and communism, you know, the idea that the working class can develop its own sense of itself. You know, our movement's got a long history of education and preparation, of developing ideas, developing a sense of itself. You know, there are loads of famous examples from all over Europe and the world. You know, if you go to any large industrial centre in Britain, you will see the remnants of that working class movement in the trade union offices, in the cooperative offices, in the various institutes, in the various organisations that were there to encourage this culture. So I think that culture has to be rebuilt. And it's not just a sort of sentimental point. And that is, this is the place where the working class and the activists who are going to win people towards socialism is going to be through that sort of process. It's going to be through, you know, quite a conscious process of creating an alternative, you know, conception of working class power. So it isn't just simply that that consciousness will develop accidentally or it will develop spontaneously. That consciousness needs to be built and needs to be developed. And so I think, you know, sessions like this, but the wider development of democracy in the labour movement is absolutely significant, absolutely, you know, fundamental. Because if we do believe that socialism is about, you know, the self-emancipation of the working class, then we have to start creating the means for that to occur. We can't just rely upon accident. The last point I'll make is the historical experience of all sorts of revolutions and indeed of all sorts of movements isn't just simply that some sort of social crisis throws up a revolution, There have been plenty of social crises. There have been plenty of, catastrophic developments. But the key point is a conscious movement that can, intervene and can pose a way forward. And that's why I think education and democracy are the two elements that can help us develop that sort of movement. Anyway, I'll leave it there, but we can obviously come back on many of the points because I'm sure they're going to be quite central.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Okay, Alan, we'll try you again. Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
That's better.
Good.
You're just shaking a bit.
Yeah, that's a very old laptop, so I was using it. So there's a lot of things coming up there in discussion, but I'm going to just make one point or talk about one issue, and that was different class forms of democracy. Because I think if you look at the commune, as Kevin pointed to at the end of his presentation, I think that marks not just a point of departure in Marx's understanding about the nature of state power, but that also extends to governmental power. And I think this is, as Kevin says, that's only begun to be discussed and thought out by Marx, but I think that it's developed more clearly by Lenin, particularly in State and Revolution. And that's that proletarian forms of organisation and democracy are quite different from bourgeois forms of democracy, largely parliamentarian. And that it's important for the working class to understand and to start to develop those new forms of proletarian democracy in the struggle today. I think that was kind of mentioned by one of the earlier speakers. And as a Trotskyist, I support Trotskyist organisation, the Bolshevik tendency. I think that that's absolutely essential. And from my own experience of the class struggle, this is not just an abstract question of the future, but it's something that will infect all our activity as revolutionaries. So I was involved in something of a semi-mass movement in Ireland a few years ago, the campaigns against household and water charges. And this very issue of the way that we would organise and what types of organisation we were trying to build was something that was a constant political struggle. So you had the Socialist Party, who were, shall we say, not so keen on developing a delegated structure, a bottom-up structure, recallable delegates and so on. And this culminated towards the end of the household charges campaign with them taking a whole section of the campaign off into electoral politics and forming a new organisation, the Anti-Austerity Alliance, purely for electoral reasons. And so I think that this, and you'll see this all the time, it's, as the comrades have mentioned in terms of the trade union movement, there's a large degree of infection of approach to politics, which is influenced by bourgeois democracy and the trade union bureaucracy. And a big part of the role of revolutionaries is building an alternative to that those bureaucratic structures, something more analogous to the structures of campaigns, democratic campaigns based on recallable delegates, which is necessary to build in the trade union movement as well. That's the kind of opposition that we have to build. And that's not important. I think that's important for two reasons. One, it makes those campaigns much more real. I definitely saw that in the fight against the water charges in Ireland, here in Cove, where we had that exactly delegated structure with a significant proportion of the adult population involved actively in the campaigns. We couldn't come to all the meetings, so we had delegates. That's a natural way of organising for the working class. Yeah, I'll finish there. I think the point is clear. So I think that it's not just an abstract question. It affects our everyday politics, and we need to be building those structures, not just for those campaigns, but also, as Kevin pointed out, for the different kind of state that we're going to have, a state that is withering away from the very beginning, unlike bourgeois institutions and bourgeois states. Finished. Thanks.
Thanks, Alan. Absolutely. The democracy is internal, isn't it? Our own structures have to be democratic, as well as fighting for democracy, for democratic demands. Okay, hello, Marie, you're next.
Hello. This is a particularly rich debate. I'm going to do my best to try to make my point. I have taken the point of Kevin from the very beginning when he talks about the working class. The working class, if I understood well, in my own words, I would say he said is a universal class in the sense that it has the interest, which is the interest of the human being, which is not based on competition or war, and it has the ability, which is its role in the economy and in society, so that it can change things. So the whole point now is that class to take power and to transform society. This is the whole gist of the matter, it seems to me, so that the human being is finally free of its dependence on things like we are now, on objects, on commerce, but is now able to create in the name of the human being, not in the name of trade or in the name of being famous. So to go back, I understood another principle, I thought, is that the bourgeois class, when it was developing, it had to defend itself from the feudal class. And then it was also developing the proletariat against which it had also to defend itself. And so it was in a permanent, and it is in a permanent struggle, which is very well expressed in this permanency, the Revolution Impermanence. I think it is happening not just to the bourgeois class, but also to the bureaucracies. It's the principle a little bit like on a football pitch, that one side advances is a retreat for the other side, and is a constant struggle one against the other, except that in our case it's going towards a goal. Is a human being needs to live. And if we look for the pandemic now, we look at the pandemic, well, unless we actually manage this problem quite quickly, it costs lives. How many people are going to die because we haven't got one single thinking head in the world, because we haven't got one universal way of thinking? How many people have got to die? And now, not in the future. And the same applies with a war, which is obviously being prepared. There is obviously a war being prepared that nobody talks about. And unless we tackle it, we are going to give a scope to this destruction, which is not necessary. And so just to try to bring this a little bit to a close, I see the question in the Labour Party as the thirst for democracy. There is an absolute unanimity that we want democracy in the Labour Party. But for some comrades, it's just to return to the Labour Party of before, which apparently, supposedly, was socialist, which is an idealism. It was never that way, really. And for other comrades, it is a way of having justice for the left. But in the end, it needs now having democracy in order to tackle where is the problem of inequality. It goes back to ownership. It is in society, and it goes back to the monarchy, which is the principle by which private ownership is eulogized and is made sacred. Private property is sacred and made sacred by the right of the bourgeoisie and the religion and the link between them. And as long as we discuss democracy, I take this as a conclusion, Kevin, from what you said for me, is that as long as we don't link, we leave democracy at the level of abstract human relations instead of the emanation of the relations from the economy, which is based on ownership, then we will not tackle who is owning the patents of the virus, for example. This has to be expropriated, these patents. They are a public good. And I think this is really very much what I would like to link in the Labour Party with the monarchy, with the question of private ownership and the question of quickly tackling private property. Is that finished?
Thank you, Marie. Anne is next. Are you able to switch on your camera, Anne? There you are. Hi.
Hi. Hey, thank you. Thank you, Kevin and comrades, for the discussion. I wanted to just say three things. Firstly, on the question of democracy, I think that it's very important for us to deal with the fact that so much of the left take their model of a party from the post-revolution of 1917, the Lenin Party after 1917, when it was, particularly after 1919, or even before then, in a situation of retreat, when it was clamping down on various discussions and debates, and was simply like not an organization that was not democratic. And forget about the fact that the way in which the model which the Bolsheviks based themselves on was the SDP, obviously the SDP before it collapsed in the First World War, but simply was an organization that based itself on democracy. Because I think, like Alan says, how important democracy is for the working class, but I think that it's not just for the trade unions or for the campaigns, it's for us in our organizations, our political organizations. And like going on to what Marion said, which I thought she made extremely good points, very well made points. I would say that like the working class, our class, needs to be able to see what debates are going on within the left, see what side they would take. They need to be concerned with every question, like questions of political differences over whether, you know, I don't know, whether Russia is an imperialist country, whether, you know, China is a worker state. All of those are really important questions because they lie at the heart of what is socialism about. And therefore, I believe that we should all be having those debates out on the left. I mean, it would be great if we weren't all in small groups, but like that we need to be having those debates out so working class people can know about them if they want to know about them and can take an interest in them, because these are crucial questions. They're not just questions within an internal discussion. So, okay, well, I think I've kind of said all I have to say on that. I just wanted to ask Kevin just about, well, what Marx and the question of women's suffrage, because I don't really know very much about what, if any, was said about that question in the First International. Obviously, I know that in the Second International, Clara Zetkin was particularly at the forefront of a battle for the international parties to take up the question of women's suffrage. And she did manage, I think in 1907, to get all the parties to sign up to it, but never really managed to succeed entirely because there was a lot of passivity and actual opposition to it, partly because women were seen as backward, and some of the party members, I think in France and in Britain as well, thought that they would cast their votes for conservative forces, but also, you know, because of basically male chauvinism. But certainly, I mean, when we're talking about, and this is another question where I disagree with Alan, in terms of dividing bourgeois democracy from workers' democracy, I think that, like many would have thought that this was just a bourgeois democratic question, but it wasn't. It certainly was an important political revolutionary question. And just finally to say that I don't think the bourgeoisie are democratic. I think the extent to which they are is because they've been forced to concede and perhaps to try and rationalize their rule, but I don't think it is democratic. So I've gone on a long time. Sorry about that, Tina.
You haven't. No, good points. Well made. Okay, Steve Freeman is next.
Hi, comrades. Thanks, Kevin, for the introduction. I don't disagree with any of the points that you made. So these points are by way of addition or elaboration, or just maybe raising some points that I've got maybe three to make. The first one, I think, and kind of what comrades are saying as well, is that I think we should see the working class as the only democratic class in society. You can compare that with the petty bourgeoisie, whose mode of existence is either through individualism, you know, you're running your own business, or you're in the managerial class, therefore you're operating through bureaucratic ways of managing the workforce under you. Or you're in the bourgeoisie, who manage either by autocratic rule, or perhaps they're liberals. I mean, you have a boss who's quite a liberal, or you have a boss who's an autocrat. But the working class is the only democratic class in this sense that, not that every worker is democratic, you could simply say that the working class was individuals, atomized individuals who don't own any property. But they only really become a class a class for themselves as opposed to a class in themselves when they start to organise democratically. And that's essentially what trade unions are. It's workers beginning, even in a sectional way, to organise themselves democratically. They're starting to take shape as a class. And so Marx's point, you can get to a higher form of that when you begin to take shape with a political class, a political form of democracy for political struggle. So I think we should see the only class. The bourgeoisie disguise themselves as Democrats. They're always preaching democracy, but they're not. In essence, they cannot be, because democracy is a threat to their property. So they're always going to be hostile to democracy, however they want to present themselves. You know, all our politicians are talking about democracy all the time and what great Democrats they are. But this is just a mask, a concealment. So that's the first point. The second point I wanted to make was that for me, the class struggle, there's the economic struggle, the struggle for wages and conditions, but the political struggle of the working class is the struggle for democracy. When the working class engages in political struggle, it's fighting for votes for women, freedom of speech, elected politicians, freedom, lots of partial little small demands, which take up together a historical struggle to advance democracy. And of course, this struggle for democracy is sometimes we're winning and going forward, and other times we're being massively defeated by fascism and things like that when all the democracies are removed. So it's a battle that goes backwards and forwards. So when Marx spoke about winning the battle for democracy, that's the idea. When the working class comes to power as the democratic class, and it democratically organizes society, then that battle has been won. So that means that we have to take democracy very seriously if we are to speak about the working class in any meaningful sense. And we have to encourage the working class to organize themselves democratically. We have to facilitate it, and we have to bring the science of democracy, because that's what Marx was. He had the scientific understanding of democracy. That's why he understood the Paris Commune and things like that. And I'll maybe finish. So that takes me back to Kevin's first point of the three that he read from the Communist Manifesto. The formation of the proletariat into a class, he said, was the first of the three things that he said from the Communist Manifesto. So the struggle for democracy is about the formation of the proletariat into a class. Through many partial struggles, many bigger struggles, even to taking power. And in that sense, republicanism and democracy are not totally separate. They can be separated, but they are really fused together in different things. And my last point is, the last point I think was already said, but democracy is not the end, it's the means to the end. So this, in struggling for democracy, we're not achieving, even if we had a fully democratic society, completely democratized, if property was held privately, then it wouldn't be a democracy at all, because anything we voted on would be immediately countermanded by the people who own stuff. So ultimately, a fully democratic society has to take property, has to do away with private property, because it cannot survive as a democracy with private property. But the route to that, getting rid of private property, is through the struggle for democracy. I'll finish there, Conrad. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Kevin, do you want to come back in now, or shall I take some more speakers?
No, I'll just come back in briefly, Tina, so the thread doesn't get lost. I think I'm in fairly agreement with most comrades who've spoken in the general sense. I think Alan Gibson's point about the way that our practice in the labour movement, and indeed our sort of understanding of how we organise, is very much linked to our ideas of democracy, not just because they're in a sense a sort of good idea, but because it's very much linked to how we see socialism and a socialist consciousness developing. And I think his reference there to Ireland was interesting, in that you know, there's nothing wrong at all. Not only is there nothing wrong, I mean, I'm an advocate of using electoral politics as a form of platform. But if the movement then becomes a sort of set of onlookers whose only job is to turn up and vote, and really to act as cheerleaders for the deputies in the Dáil or wherever, then that's obviously not what Marx or anybody else sees as the battle of political democracy. Because I think one of the things that keeps on coming through is that comrades are very keen on developing democracy, not just because they think it's a good idea, a sort of an abstract good idea, but actually because it is in a way of raising our consciousness and in a way pointing the way to the future. You know, the labor movement when it developed in the 19th and 20th century saw its practice as, in a sense, marking where the future was going to be. And I suppose if you think about it, if you turn that on its head, that sort of electoral politics of the sort that, that Alan mentioned, but also the bureaucratic politics or the technocratic politics, the sort of Fabian managerial politics, or the top-down politics of Stalinism, all of those reflect the type of society that their initiators want. So that the social democratic form that you might see in the Labour Party is one in which the mass of the party members are simply there as foot soldiers, and that the leadership and the MPs and others are the ones who are going to direct things. So when they talk about elections and when they talk about democracy, they see it in those terms as essentially an adjunct to the capitalist system, whereas we see the elected representatives in whichever body they sit as being our representatives, as being, you know, fighters for the working class, as people who are mobilizing the working class, not managing them. And I think this idea of what democracy is about, not just that it's something that's taken for granted, but why we think it's so important. And in case comrades, you know, like to think that these are new issues, and indeed maybe go back to the good old days. Well, as soon as the German Social Democrats got people elected to the Reichstag, even in the North German Confederation before 1870, they had problems with controlling their parliamentary deputies. So those tensions between parliamentary politicians who saw themselves as the leaders, who then went off and acted independently, and the mass of their members who saw them as being spokespeople for the party, that tension was really there at the beginning. And indeed, if you look at Marx and Engels' correspondence with people like Kautsky and Bebel and Liebknecht and so on, you see this all the time. So in a sense, this even at the beginning of the movement, these tensions are there. And I suppose if we really want to look at it, it goes back to that sort of almost non-political type of approach of people like Lassalle. You know, Lassalle just said it was necessary for leaders like him to do deals with Bismarck. And the top-down approach, I think, is really quite prominent in our organizations. And that means that that sort of fight then becomes central, not just for a space, but because it really revolves from a very different conception of socialism. You know, if socialism is just about getting Keir Starmer into government, or even I would say Jeremy Corbyn, you know, if all we've got to Jeremy Corbyn and hey presto, it's done, you know, that isn't my conception of socialism. It's a very different conception of socialism, and it's one that in which democracy, in the sense of the power of the collective, is at the heart of that. I think Marie made some very good points about the nature of the proletariat as a universal class. And I suppose one of the things that's been lost, both because of the impact of Stalinism, but also of the defeats of the working class movement, and I would argue the developments in capitalism as well, is that sort of sense of the working class as a class that has that sort of capability, that sort of sense that we ourselves can run society. I mean, one of the things that always strikes me about sections of the working class that were the most combative historically often had a sense of themselves as being quite capable, not just of running the factory, but of running society. And that was even reflected, I'd say, in quite right-wing social democrats. Admittedly, they didn't really want to transform Germany, or they didn't want to transform Britain, but they had a sense that the working class had a particular place in that society. So conversely, even though it was very much a reactionary project, it built upon a sense of the proletariat's position. So in a sense, it almost took that sense of working class solidarity and power and then turned it on itself. And I think you can see that most clearly in the case of the German social democratic leaders and what they did, you know, in the period between between 1918 and 1933. So I think it is, I think, significant, you know, in that way. I'm going to confess, Anne, that I don't know Marx's position on female suffrage. I think that's I did come across some debates in the International about separate organisation for women and the idea of women being having their own organisations and/or the branches of the International being made up of you know, both men and women. But I would presume that Marx favoured it, but I know that very few of the radical Democrats at the time advocated it. So I'm going to have to go away and do some homework. There's always one question that flummoxes me, and you've asked it tonight. So I'll go away and look at it. That's my only comment initially on that one. But one thing about the idea of democracy, because it links in with something that Steve said, is this idea that capitalism portrays itself as democratic. Indeed, it suggests that, you know, capitalism and liberal democracy are one and the same thing. So I think this identification has to be countered. And I think that means that we have to identify our movement with democracy. Now, we've got a whole history of disasters and defeats, which has ended that. And that means we've got to rescue the banner of democracy. We've got to rescue the banner of socialism from those various defeats and betrayals and besmirchments. You know, I mean, we don't perhaps need to be told about that. But one of the points is that I think in the coming period, I think the state and issues of democracy will become more important. And I think particularly the tendencies within capitalism are for the state to acquire not only a more authoritarian basis, but also a more Bonapartist and indeed, you know, a more independent one. And that means that control over the state, the nature of that state, who the ruling class are, then I think becomes more and more central. So, you know, for example, in the Brexit debate, there were on occasions, you know, perhaps they might seem rather arcane constitutional questions, but the nature of Crown in Parliament, the nature of the monarchy, the nature of the relationship of the law, of the legislative and the judicial to the legislative, all of these things were raised, but as part of political debate, it wasn't there. In other words, the nature of political structures and the nature of the state, I think, will become quite central issues. And I think it means that we then have to take a position on it. They can't just be regarded as sort of optional extras. And that, I think, will be a product of the type of crises and the type of dynamics that Anthony referred to right at the beginning, and you know, in that way. The other point is this, the one that Steve made, and I think Anne made as well, about the fact that the state and the ruling class have made concessions to us in the form of political democracy. And as we've seen in the United States with voter suppression, and indeed, as we've seen here with some sections of the Tories talking about trying to do the same thing with voter ID, or in other ways restricting democratic rights, these rights have to be constantly fought for. And again, we have to make the point that capitalism is not identical with democracy, and that the real fighters for democracy have been the working class. I referred to the sort of conventional historiography about historical breakthrough. And those of us who've worked in education for a number of years know that the sort of official mythology of Britain is of gradual development and of you know, a relatively harmonious development towards democracy. It's not unlike those charts that we used to have on the wall at school showing the evolution of man. And what happens is that man starts from being some rather ape-like creature, and then he starts to rise and stands up straight. And British democracy is the same. We start off with the bad old days, and the rulers sort of gradually realize that we ought to improve things, and we just get where we are now. But of course, we know that's been a history of struggle. And that history of struggle, we have to constantly remind people of that, and indeed have to emphasize that that struggle isn't over. And that, you know, I think we are moving into a period that this current crisis is an example of it, but the other tensions and conflicts that comrades are talking about will throw it up as well. Anyway, I'll leave it there for the second.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, Matthew Jones, then Ian, and then Alan wants to come back in again. If anybody else wants to speak, please click raise hand.
Hey, comrades, it's been good debate. I'm sorry, I didn't see the first 15 minutes or so, but I think it's very interesting. I think the position really, in terms of the democracy and particularly of the capitalist class, I think you have to look at it in terms of the wider thing. You know, is it, you know, democracy is about you know, labour being free, you know, free and the legal position of the individual and all this sort of stuff, rather than just purely, you know, the right to vote. And clearly, you know, the interesting thing, I think, is the evolution of the concept of permanent revolution, which is of course devised by Marx in relatively brief comment, you know, in term coming out of the revolutions of 1848, and then of course is further developed by Trotsky after 1905, and actually said, well, okay, you know, the bourgeoisie actually, you know, in fear for the fact that you can see the working class behind it, fails to even deal with the autocracy. It doesn't actually want to deal with the autocracy and clean out the old system, and will keep parts of the old system because it's in fear of the working class, and it becomes more so obviously once you get down to the point of in Russia, where they're clearly just actually resting and aligning themselves nakedly with the Tsarist autocracy, you know, because obviously the mortal fear of the workers for obvious reasons. So there's that, you know, in terms of, as I say, a broader view of democracy than purely voting. I think the other thing is about, and as you say, in terms of the struggle to get the vote and to say, okay, well, you know, the bourgeoisie is not democratic by nature. In fact, the reverse, and in fact concedes, you know, only in terror of its existence again after the Russian Revolution. And in fact, the vote in this country is only conceded in the 20s, you know, in the aftermath of that event. And I think the other thing, of course, is the impact on terms of the working class. I mean, it's very interesting. I saw a piece looking at the rates of participation in elections in I think it was in Glasgow over the piece. And of course, after the vote was given, in you know, the vote was won after the following First World War. The participation in this city was in excess of 80% because people thought that would make a difference. And then so it became obvious as it goes on, the period, that of course it makes no bloody difference. It all makes much less difference than you would expect, you know. And of course you get the same old you know, bunch of useless parasites usually. And of course, the participation rate now is below 50% because people can see, you know, the people we're being offered have got no record, they're not serious, and they're not going to do anything that's going to make a difference to anything in particular. So it's only a question of, okay, you know, it's trying to excavate that and say to people that democracy is important, but you do need to have people who actually have a record of fighting and an organisation with a record in fighting the working class. And the thing is also, I think the other thing, of course, is there is a difference. And we have to draw this one out. I think we have to draw out in terms of a fight for a democracy in the state, even a bourgeois state. But the other thing, of course, is that the organs of the working class themselves are democratic, but they're completely separate and they're completely different. They have different character completely. Hence the difference, you know, between a workers' a Soviet or a workers' committee or whatever else, and the power of the working class to the bourgeois state. And the fact that for really, any serious socialist, in terms of walking into one of these bourgeois state institutions, has to view that not as some kind of great democratic institution, but in fact the territory of the enemy. You are venturing on the territory of the enemy. Okay, you have to use it, but you have to understand what it is and how you behave in it, and what you do when you're there. That you represent the power of something else, another class, and another society. In fact, to the one that institution exists to perpetrate. And that applies all the way down from Parliament to the local councils. And really, people should we should draw this out in terms of the nature between the difference between ours and theirs, and how our people and our representatives should behave in terms of venturing into these institutions, and they don't belong to us. And when we're done, we should be done with them, and we'll institute our own.
Thank you, comrade. I'm going to sneak in quickly. Sorry, Ian. Kevin's confession that he hadn't thought about the women's question, or hadn't read it up in preparation for this session. Why would he? Made me think why we actually haven't put the origins of the family down as one of the issues that we could look at in this series. And I think we should actually do it, because that's, I think, is a very important work in terms of women's liberation, or more to the point, women's oppression. Engels looked at why the oppression of women started and locates it in the sort of rise of class society in the Neolithic area. And I think that would be really interesting to look at. I think in that text, I think, in the Communist Manifesto as well, isn't it? They're talking about the Aufheben, the overcoming of the family structures, which again, is not something you would call for unless you take the fight for women's liberation quite seriously, because that's what it does. The family is there to cohere property, and to basically the woman is your property too, if you're a man in the during the rise of class society. So I think that would be a really interesting session actually to look at. So we should plan for that, because that was fascinating. I'm not sure myself either if Marx actually wrote about women's suffrage, but it was an issue that wasn't quite as massively on the agenda as it is today. But certainly, if you look at their practice and their family structures, well, they were kind of bourgeois, petty bourgeois lifestyles they led, with affairs with the housemaid and that kind of thing, and quite kind of bourgeois lifestyles. The family of and especially Marx's daughter and wife got very involved in politics and with the Paris Commune, etc. So they were liberated women in that sense, and especially his daughter Eleanor took over much of his work and translation, etc. So I think that would be a really good session to actually put on just plan for in our series. Sorry, Ian, you're next.
That's all right, comrade. Just quickly as an aside, I've always thought the debate about women's suffrage in the early Labour Party, I don't know what Marx's view on it was either, but it's a very good example of some of the same troubles we're facing today with identity politics and the like, because you had a polarised debate sometimes between suffragettes who were claiming for women's suffrage on the same basis as men, i.e. rich women at the time, not all women and not all men, and then others saying no women until we've got all manhood suffrage. And it was the left of the left in the Labour Party that was saying campaign for both of those at the same time, for genuinely universal suffrage, and cutting through this kind of polarisation between class and identity, I guess, and that question. But my main contribution was really, I've been thinking a lot about this 1848 issue recently in the context of the United States politics, and how the bourgeoisie and the liberals were completely useless in fighting for their own program, never mind going over into anything else. And possibly out of fear of going over into anything more radical. Because what's happening in America is, since the start of this century, the Republicans have been consistently a minority. They've lost the popular vote every single time, except for the khaki election in 2004, soon after 9/11. And yet, half the time they've been in power in the White House, and they control most of the states, most of the Supreme Court, and so on, while their shrinking base radicalizes towards the right. And we've seen the kind of culmination of that so far, at least, in the QAnon storming of the Capitol. And there's some quite simple democratic reforms that the Democrats could do to take that on. They could admit Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. to the Union. They could, obviously, would be better to go further and deal with the incomplete nature of US democracy itself, the Electoral College, unelected lifetime very party political appointments of judges, and so on, and obviously stand up to the obscene vote rigging, which isn't targeted at the likes of Donald Trump, but is targeted by the Republicans at the Democrats, though also used by the Democrats in their own primaries against the likes of Bernie Sanders. And I think under pressure of how bad the situation's got with Trump and the resistance against him, they've fought a little bit harder this time on not letting the election be stolen from them by Trump's vexatious claims. But in terms of actually making even modest reforms, like admitting Puerto Rico, more wide-ranging ones like getting rid of the college or expanding or abolishing the Supreme Court, I think they won't do it. I think they won't do it because if they got rid of this scarecrow of the Republican Party, reduced them to a permanent minority, then what would be the excuse for the corporate Dems? We have to work across the aisle, we have to elect a centrist candidate to appeal to the middle ground and get elected. They'd be in danger of the majority tendency in the majority party in the United States now, especially among the youth, is positive towards socialism. But at the same time, that same centre-left emphasis on the centre party has become the preferred instrument of rule of capital because of the crisis in the Republicans, becoming so radicalised towards the right in all sorts of unreliable ways. So in a way, it's redolent of 1848, where the bourgeois liberals won't even fight their own corner because it's convenient for them to have the reactionaries around as a foil in order to contain the left. So I wonder if Kevin sees any similarities in that too. And also in terms of not fighting for democracy, I've been thinking a lot about the Burmese coup in the last few days, and the absolutely horrific strategy of Aung San Suu Kyi. If you think Jeremy Corbyn was weak, the very complete rolling over for the generals, and now the tanks have rolled over that government. And I saw one comment on Facebook today that I quite liked, that it turns out even the liberals can't just take over the existing apparatus of the state, that even they have to change it. And interestingly, the real successful fights for democracy in the world, in South America, South Africa, and so on, more in the last century really, have been led by socialist forces of various kinds that have often been not so good at achieving socialism, but certainly in removing specific authoritarian or racist regimes that act as an extra block, and focusing attention on the underlying class aspect of society for a newer generation possibly to pick up. I think in South Africa that's already happening, and even moving in a bit more of an explicitly socialist direction in Latin America. These have been the movements that have been going forward, whereas a kind of explicitly liberal, I think Wikipedia's page says formerly socially democratic, now liberal conservative approach in the NLD, it wasn't even able to fight for liberal values of for example, equal citizenship. Aung San Suu Kyi wouldn't even say the word Rohingya. And now the guy who was really pushing that genocide has arrested her for having illegally imported walkie-talkies, which could get the person 80% of the population voted for barred from holding any further public office for life. So that's where the kind of go along to get ahead liberalism is perhaps taking you now in the world. There was a brief period, of course, where there was more of an association between capitalism and democracy again in 1989 because of the Cold War rolling back of communism, getting into that chink in Stalinism's armor, a very big chink in terms of its lack of democracy. But I think that that phase seems to have already been passed. And between 1848 and 1989, it seems to have been more the left that was fighting for democracy than explicitly bourgeois forces. So yeah, it's certainly in terms of the political situations as diverse, I guess, as Myanmar and the United States are. I think we're seeing evidence that socialists are the best democrats, revolutionaries are the best reformists, perhaps. I don't know if that was an SWP specific slogan or if it was from the classics. I don't know, Kevin might know. And that, yeah, that even to achieve liberal democratic ends or reformist ends in terms of the Labour Party, some of the combativity of a more revolutionary perspective is required. Anyway, I'll shut up. Now I'd like to see if Kevin agrees with any of those parallels I've drawn.
Okay. Yes, we're actually running a bit over today, but I think it's a worthwhile discussion. Alan wants to come back briefly, and then Kevin will be summing up. Thank you.
Yeah, just to take up where Matthew left off, I think, to defend the idea of a distinction between working class democracy and capitalist democracy. This isn't a particularly new idea. I was just doing a quick search on Google. Lenin writes about it in 1905, quite early on. And that conception of understanding the institutions of bourgeois democracy as being in the NEB camp is very important. And that we need to build our own organisations. And there's no way to understand, for me, the concept of dual power without seeing that contention between the organisations of the working class and the organisations of the bourgeoisie. And those include the democratic, limited democracy of bourgeois democracy in parliaments and the more full and real and rich democracy of proletarian democracy. And I also think this distinction is very important in a more abstract political sense, because if you say that this distinction isn't important and there's just democracy, then you can slip, I think, and quite often people do, slip into the idea, well, it's just a matter then of making Parliament more democratic. That these institutions are not tied to class, don't have a class nature, that there isn't this distinction. Therefore, it's just a matter of getting more and more and more democracy within these existing institutions. And that's the parliamentary road to socialism. And it's manifest by many who go down that road. It's manifest by the Socialist Party, to go back to my first intervention, who intervened against the idea of building proto-workers' committees, of building proto-Soviets. That was a bad idea. They thought it was hilarious, a crazy idea. That's not how you build a campaign. You build a campaign so that it can elect people to Parliament and make Parliament more democratic by getting more of us into it. The idea of a distinction between bourgeois democracy and proletarian democracy, I think, is part of the distinction between revolutionary and reformist politics. Finish.
Thanks, Alan. Okay, okay. Steve wants to come in briefly as well. We'll take Steve for 2 minutes if you can keep it brief, comrade.
Will be very brief. I just wanted to comment to what Alan said. It's absolutely true. You contrast bourgeois and proletarian democracy, the democracy of the working class. But the point is that to win power, the working class has to invade the institutions of the state and put them really on the spot, but only by fighting politically within what bourgeois democracy allows us to do, can the working class be educated to take power? Whereas Alan seems to say, on bourgeois democracy, we're abstaining. And that's wrong. The fight for democracy goes into bourgeois institutions and not just in the working class itself. And that's why you have to take up the right to vote and all these other democratic, the national question, republicanism. These are fights within the bourgeois democracy, which gets the working class there. I'll finish that. That's short. That's it. Stop.
Okay, thanks, Conrad. Okay, Kevin.
Right, I think we've got the subject for about 4 or 5 other sessions.
I know.
Yeah?
That's good.
Particularly on the issue of in the enemy camp and how socialists and so on should use parliaments and councils as platforms. Mm-hmm. And also Tina's point on the family and Marx's ideas on feminism and so forth. And of course, there is a rich tradition of that. August Bebel, the German socialist, wrote on this, perhaps surprisingly in some ways, but to many of the socialists in this period, they linked class and other oppressions together. And I think it's a good example of the way that the idea of democracy and it isn't just a purely sort of political conception. You're looking at a different type of society, and indeed the emancipation of women, along with other groups who are oppressed in society. I'll just respond to a couple of the points. I think that the key question that lies really here in the debate is the question of raising the socialist consciousness of the population, of the working class, of attempting to begin to create a movement that is conscious of itself, that is a movement for the transformation of society. And so the utilization of bourgeois democracy, the utilization of all the platforms and the means of doing that are ones that we should, we should take up. So in that sense, the point that Steve Freeman made right at the end is one, and I'm sure he was echoing that, was one that Engels made in reference to the Bakuninites, when he talked about, in terms of France, when he said that, if we abstain, then we're really handing over weapons in that way. I think we're not utilizing all the means, that at our disposal, and that this is a great weapon that could be used by the working class. I think in particular that as the state will become more central in politics, then issues of formal political democracy will be raised. And I think that in raising them, we're not encouraging illusions in the nature of the state. We're not turning it into a mere battle to make Parliament more democratic. What we're arguing is that the bourgeoisie claims to stand on the basis of democracy, and we're holding them to that. But perhaps more importantly, we're using those institutions, we're making a critique of them, and we're showing their class nature, we're showing how they're linked to the nature of capitalist power. And that is a battleground that we can't abandon. I agree with Alan that if we just see our leaders in Parliament as participating in that system, and the same with Matthew as well, if they're there just to get their noses in the trough, or there was that case recently in Wales where assembly members were suspended because they were found to be drinking together. For me, the big crime wasn't that they were drinking in the Senate. The big crime was that the Labour and the Tory members were sitting together in a sort of socializing sort of atmosphere. The assemblies and the parliaments are battlegrounds, and we should go into those places and treat them like that. But that's because we have a conception of politics as a struggle, as a class struggle, in which our movement is an instrument for the emancipation of the working class. And that means that we look at the state and we look at the institutions of the state in a very different way. And our democratic demands are designed to expose that and reveal the nature of that, I think, in that way. On Ian's point, I think you made some very good points, Ian, about America. And in many ways, the situation in America is one in which the democratic elements in the American system, you know, the rhetoric of the Constitution, the idea of the election of all sorts of officials is a very important one. But of course, you've revealed through things like the Electoral College and indeed the concentration of executive power in the presidency, you've revealed its weaknesses. And of course, the Constitution was designed to be oligarchic. Not only was the Senate designed as a blocking mechanism, but the Electoral College isn't just some sort of quaint hangover. It was actually designed as an indirect form of democracy to prevent the election of, quote, unsuitable candidates. So those constitutional survivals are not just through atrophy, they're not just through quaintness, they're actually part of an attempt to stymie popular democratic power. So democratic demands in America about ending the nature of the Senate, you know, going for one chamber, removing the executive power of the president and having simply a parliamentary or a representative democracy rather than the Bonapartist system of presidents, an elected monarch in effect. Those could be quite important political demands for socialists to take up, because what they do is they take the rhetoric of the Constitution and they turn it back on itself. They take the rhetoric of capitalism about political democracy and we expose it. And in doing so, we talk about how the struggle to achieve those things could be achieved within capitalism, but it would require a mighty struggle. But in the course of that struggle, it would be one which would raise the questions of power and the nature and the direction of society. I think my last sort of concluding thought is about the idea of mystification, which has sort of come up in a number of the comments. The thing about democracy, I think, is that in many ways it is a form of mystification, that behind all the flummery in the British Parliament, behind all the formalities and behind all the structure is a structure of power. And what democracy does is to give us an illusion of influence, to give us an illusion of some representation in it. But it is an illusion. And our fight for democracy is not only a fight for the right to vote, to maintain that right, but it's also for the right to organize and the right to develop our class and to develop their consciousness as a potential ruling class. If we can't do that, if we can't develop that consciousness, then any sort of socialism that's going to emerge will be managerial, it will be top down, it will be bureaucratic. Unless there's conscious participation, unless we really do have a conscious political movement and we have a movement that's democratic, in which democracy is not just a form, but it's an absolute culture, is a way of seeing the world, is a way of practicing the world. Unless we have those things, then we will not, I think, create the type of socialist society that I certainly want. We certainly won't. It won't be one which will be carried out by the working class. It will be another form altogether. And history, where the working class does take power but is unable to hold on to power, we see the sort of systems that have arisen in its place. So, comrades, some interesting things tonight. I've certainly made me think about them, and certainly for some good ideas for future sessions. But I think I'll leave it there, and thanks very much.
Thank you, comrade. Thank you, comrades, for staying slightly longer than usual. Cutting through the illusion of democracy is certainly one of the key tasks of our education series. Next week, we'll be looking at Marx and religion. Everybody knows the famous quote about the opium, etc., etc. But Marx actually had a much deeper understanding, a much richer understanding of the role of religion and how it relates to the working class and their struggle. So that'd be a very interesting session to tune into. Also, just to say that Comrade Anne McShane has agreed to speak on the women's question and Marx, and looking at Engels's writing and Bebel's writing. So we're going to put that on March the 18th. So that's going to be a new session at the end. And no doubt Kevin's got some ideas for a few other sessions on using Parliament as a platform or whatever. So we can expand on that question as well. So thanks very much, comrades, for joining us. Have a good evening and see you next week, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Bye.